When I pulled back that rusted metal panel in my grandfather's barn, I never expected to find something that would bring the entire U.S. Air Force to our small Montana farm. My name is Bryn Calloway, and what I discovered that day didn't just change my life, it rewrote history. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. I'm standing here now in what used to be my grandfather Ezra's forbidden barn. The one he told me for 24 years was just full of old farming equipment. The massive doors behind me haven't been opened since he passed 6 months ago, and honestly, I was terrified to even touch them. Grandpa Ezra was the kind of man who meant what he said, and when he said something was off limits, you didn't question it. But here's the thing about losing the person who raised you. Suddenly all those rules don't seem to matter anymore. When the bank started calling about the farm payments and I realized I might lose the only home I'd ever really known, I knew I had to catalog every single thing on this property. Even the things in the barn that Grandpa swore was nothing but junk. I grabbed my crowbar that morning, the same one he taught me to use when I was 12, and helping him fix the tractor. My hands were shaking as I pried open those heavy wooden doors, and the smell that hit me wasn't the musty scent of old hay bales or rusted farm equipment I expected. It was the distinct smell of aviation fuel and metal polish, a scent I knew better than anyone because I've been working on aircraft engines since I graduated from technical school. The sunlight streamed through those doors for the first time in decades, and what I saw stopped my heart completely. Under a series of heavy canvas tarps sat the silhouette of something that definitely wasn't a combine harvester or a hay rake. The shape was sleek, pointed, with what looked like wings folded back against a fuselage. I knew aircraft like most people know their own heartbeat, and this was definitely a plane. My grandfather, Ezra Calloway, was supposed to be a simple Montana farmer who grew wheat and raised cattle. He was the man who taught me how to change engine, oil, how to read hydraulic systems, and how to never give up on something just because it looked broken beyond repair. He was quiet, methodical, and never talked much about anything that happened before I came to live with him when my parents died. But as I stood there staring at what was clearly a military aircraft hidden in his barn, I realized that everything I thought I knew about the man who raised me might have been a carefully constructed story. The grandfather who tucked me in every night and made pancakes every Sunday morning had been keeping a secret that was about to turn both our worlds upside down. What I found under those tarps that day would bring military officials to our front door, reveal a classified operation that had been buried for 80 years, and prove that sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones with the biggest mysteries to share. This is the story of how a rusted warplane changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my future, and what it really means to honor the people we love. Let me take you back to how my life looked before I found that plane, because understanding where I was emotionally will help you realize why this discovery hit me like a freight train. 6 months ago, I was a completely different person with completely different problems. I had just turned 24 and was working as a certified aircraft mechanic at Glacier Park International Airport, about an hour's drive from our family farm in Whitefish. It wasn't the job I'd dreamed of since I was 8 years old, tinkering with Grandpa's old Cessna engine in his workshop, but it paid the bills. Mostly I was doing routine maintenance on small private planes and the occasional commercial aircraft that needed minor repairs. My real dream was to work on vintage military aircraft, the kind you see at air shows and museums. There's something about those planes that speaks to my soul. The craftsmanship, the history, the way every rivet and wire tells a story about the people who built them and flew them. But those jobs are rare, and they usually go to mechanics with decades more experience than I had. Then Grandpa Ezra got sick. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in January and gone by March. It happened so fast that I'm still having trouble accepting he's really not coming back. One day we were planning which fields to plant for spring, and the next day I was sitting in a hospital room holding his hand while machines beeped around us. Ezra had raised me since I was 8, when my parents died in a car accident during a Montana blizzard. I don't remember much about my mom and dad, but I remember everything about the day this quiet, strong farmer showed up at the Children's Services office and said, That's my granddaughter, and she's coming home with me. No discussion, no hesitation. Just a man who saw a scared little girl and decided she belonged with family. He taught me everything I know about fixing things. Not just engines and machinery, but the philosophy behind repair work. Bryn, he used to say, most people throw away things that look broken, but everything can be fixed if you're patient enough to understand how it was supposed to work in the first place. That lesson shaped who I became, both as a mechanic and as a person. The farm had been in our family for 3 generations. 200 acres of wheat fields and pasture land, with a main house that Ezra built himself in 1978, and that big red barn that dominated the property. I loved everything about that place. The way the mountains looked in the early morning, the sound of wind moving through the wheat, the smell of hay and motor oil that seemed to live in every building. But loving something and being able to afford it are 2 very different things. Medical bills had eaten through Grandpa's savings, and the farm had been operating at a loss for the past few years. Small family farms in Montana aren't exactly profitable ventures anymore. I was looking at property taxes, medical debt, and a mortgage that I couldn't handle on a mechanic's salary. The bank had already sent 2 letters about missed payments, and I knew I had maybe 3 months before they started foreclosure proceedings. I spent every evening after work sitting at Grandpa's old kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of bills, trying to make the numbers work. They never did. That's when I decided I had to do a complete inventory of everything on the property. Maybe there was something valuable I could sell, some antique farm equipment or tools that collectors would want. I went through the house first, then the workshop, then the smaller storage buildings. Everything was exactly what it appeared to be. Nothing particularly valuable. The barn was my last option. I'd been avoiding it partly out of respect for Grandpa's wishes, but mostly because I was afraid of what I might find there. Not afraid of anything dangerous, but afraid that it really would be nothing but old farming equipment, which would mean I was completely out of options for saving the farm. I remember standing in front of those barn doors on that Tuesday morning, in September, holding the same crowbar Grandpa had taught me to use, and thinking this was probably the end of everything I'd ever called home. I was already mentally preparing myself to start looking for apartments in town and figure out how to sell off 200 acres to pay the debts. That's the emotional state I was in when I forced those doors open and discovered that my quiet, predictable grandfather had apparently been living with a secret that was about to change everything. The first thing I did after pulling off those canvas tarps was run my hands along the fuselage like I was checking to make sure it was real. The metal was cold and solid, with patches of rust but still structurally sound. I knew immediately what I was looking at. This was a P-51 Mustang, one of the most famous fighter planes from World War II, but something was wrong with this picture. I'd studied P-51s extensively in technical school. I'd seen dozens of them at air shows and museums. I knew every specification, every design detail, every variation that was ever manufactured. This plane had the basic P-51 frame, but there were modifications I'd never seen before. Extra panel access points along the wings, unusual wiring configurations visible through gaps in the cowling, and what looked like additional instrumentation, mounted in places that didn't match any standard P-51 design. The serial numbers that should have been stamped on the tail and wings had been deliberately filed off. Not worn away by time or weather, but carefully removed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. That alone was enough to make my mechanic's instincts scream that something wasn't right here. I spent about an hour just walking around the plane, taking mental notes of every detail. The landing gear was intact but needed work. The propeller had some damage but was repairable. The paint was faded and peeling, but underneath I could make out what looked like military markings that had been partially painted over. This wasn't just any P-51. This was a plane with secrets. Then I climbed up to look into the cockpit, and that's when everything changed. Sitting on the pilot's seat was a small metal box, about the size of a shoebox, with a combination lock that looked like it had been sitting there for decades. The numbers on the lock were faded, but I could still make them out. Without really thinking about it, I tried my birthday, EO9-1599. Nothing. Then I tried Grandpa's birthday, EO3-2246. The lock clicked open. My hands were shaking as I lifted the lid. Inside, Wrapped in oiled cloth were documents, photographs, and something that made my breath catch in my throat. Military medals. 3 of them, including a distinguished flying cross and a silver star. These weren't replicas or family heirlooms. These were real military decorations, and they all had the same name engraved on them: Staff Sergeant Ezra M. Calloway. The man who raised me, who I thought had spent his whole life farming in Montana, had apparently been a decorated war hero. And he'd never said a single word about it. The photographs were even more shocking. Black and white images of Grandpa as a young man, maybe 25 years old, standing next to various aircraft with groups of other pilots and crew members. In one photo, he was standing right next to the exact same P-51 that was now sitting in his barn, looking decades younger and wearing a military uniform I'd never seen before. But it was the documents that really made my world start spinning. The first paper I unfolded had classified stamped across the top in red letters, and below that, Operation Nightfall, authorized personnel only. I'd never heard of any World War II operation called Nightfall, and I'd read extensively about wartime aviation history. The documents described something called a prototype navigation and targeting system that was apparently decades ahead of its time. There were technical specifications that I barely understood, references to recovered enemy technology, and multiple mentions of a test flight that had gone missing in November 1945. According to these papers, the plane and its experimental equipment had disappeared during a routine training mission and was presumed lost or destroyed. But here it was, sitting in my grandfather's barn with all its experimental equipment apparently intact. The most disturbing document was a letter dated December 1945, signed by someone called Colonel Morrison. It was addressed to Sergeant Calloway, and it was short and to the point. Your mission is complete. The prototype must be considered permanently lost. All personnel involved are to maintain absolute silence regarding Operation Nightfall. This project never existed. Confirm receipt and destroy. This communication immediately. Grandpa had kept the letter for 80 years instead of destroying it. At the bottom of the box was an envelope with my name written on it in Grandpa's handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 3 months before he died. Bryn, if you're reading this, then you found what I couldn't bring myself to reveal while I was alive. This plane holds secrets that powerful people wanted buried forever. I was ordered to forget it existed, but I couldn't let this technology fall into the wrong hands or be lost to history. I've spent my entire life protecting it, waiting for the right moment to bring it back into the light. That moment is now yours to decide. Trust no one but yourself, and remember everything I taught you about fixing things that seem beyond repair. Love, Grandpa Ezra. I sat in that barn for another 2 hours, reading through every document, studying every photograph, trying to process what I'd discovered. The man who taught me to change oil and fix engines had been living with a secret that connected him to classified military operations and experimental technology that apparently didn't exist in any official records. And now I had to decide what to do with a discovery that could either save my family's farm or destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. I spent 3 sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, turning over every possible option in my mind. I could call the authorities and report the find, which would probably mean losing the plane and any chance of saving the farm. I could try to sell it privately, but who buys a military aircraft with filed-off serial numbers and classified documents? Or I could do something that went against every responsible bone in my body, something that Grandpa's letter seemed to be pushing me toward. I could restore it myself. The idea was absolutely insane. I was talking about secretly rebuilding a World War II fighter plane that was apparently connected to a classified government operation. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the only choice that honored both Grandpa's wishes and my own desperate need to save our family legacy. On Thursday morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the barn with a notebook and my entire collection of aircraft maintenance manuals. If I was going to do this, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I spent the day documenting every detail of the plane's condition, taking measurements, and making lists of what would need to be repaired or replaced. The engine was a Rolls-Royce Merlin V12, the same type used in standard P-51s, but this one had been modified with components I didn't recognize. The experimental navigation system that the documents mentioned was still mounted in the cockpit, a complex array of gauges and electronic equipment that looked decades ahead of anything that should have existed in 1945. Most of it was corroded or damaged, but the core components seemed intact. I made a decision that night that changed everything. I was going to restore this plane in secret, figure out what made it special, and then decide what to do with that information. Maybe the technology inside it really was valuable enough to save the farm. Maybe understanding what Grandpa had been, protecting all these years, would give me the closure I needed to move forward with my life. The first challenge was keeping it secret. The barn was visible from the main road, and in a town like Whitefish, people notice when you start acting differently. I decided to work only at night, using battery-powered LED lights that wouldn't be visible from outside. I told my neighbors I was cleaning out the barn to get it ready for an estate sale, which explained why I was spending so much time out there. I started with the basics. The fuel system needed to be completely rebuilt, which meant ordering parts. That wouldn't raise suspicions. I told the suppliers I was working on a restoration project for a local collector, which was technically true. The electrical system was a nightmare of corroded wires and damaged components, but it was fixable with patience and the right parts. The hardest part was the experimental equipment. I had no manuals for any of it, no technical specifications, and no way to research it without potentially alerting people I didn't want to alert. I had to reverse engineer everything, figuring out how each component was supposed to work based on the wiring diagrams and the physical connections. After 2 weeks of night work, I had the engine running. It was rough and needed tuning, but the sound of that Merlin V12 coming to life in Grandpa's barn was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever heard. I let it run for exactly 5 minutes before shutting it down, afraid that someone might hear it and start asking questions. The navigation system was more challenging. It appeared to use some kind of radio-based positioning technology that was far more advanced than anything I'd seen in my training. There were references in Grandpa's documents to recovered German radar technology and experimental guidance systems, but the technical details were beyond my understanding. That's when I made another decision that probably saved my life. I decided to research Operation Nightfall online, something I'd been avoiding because I was afraid of leaving a digital trail. What I found was absolutely nothing. No references to any World War II operation with that name. No mention of experimental P-51 variants. Nothing about recovered German technology being tested in 1945. It was like the entire operation had been erased from history, but I did find something else that made my blood run cold. I discovered that 3 other people had been asking similar questions online over the past decade. Someone in Oregon who'd found unusual aircraft parts in their grandfather's garage. Someone in Texas whose family had inherited mysterious military documents. Someone in Michigan who'd been researching their father's war service and found references to classified projects. All 3 of those people had died in accidents within 6 months of starting their research. That's when I realized I wasn't just restoring a plane. I was potentially uncovering something that people had killed to keep secret. The smart thing would have been to stop right there, rebury the secret, and walk away. But I couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa's letter, about how he'd spent his entire life protecting this technology, waiting for the right moment to bring it back into the light. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I started taking precautions. I varied my schedule, parked in different locations when I came to the barn, and started paying attention to whether anyone seemed to be watching the property. I also made copies of all the documents and hid them in 3 different locations, just in case something happened to the originals. The restoration was becoming an obsession. Every night after my regular job, I'd come home to the barn and work, until exhaustion forced me to stop. The plane was slowly coming back to life under my hands, and with each repaired system, I felt like I was getting closer to understanding what Grandpa had been protecting. But I was also getting closer to something else. 3 weeks into the project, I started noticing cars driving slowly past the farm during the day. Always different vehicles, always with out-of-state license plates, always with drivers who seemed more interested in the buildings than the road. Someone knew what I was doing, and they were starting to close in. On a cold October morning, exactly 1 month after I'd started the restoration, I woke up to find 3 black SUVs parked in my driveway. My first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. If these were the same people who had silenced, the others running would only delay the inevitable. I walked out to meet them wearing my coveralls and carrying a cup of coffee, trying to look like someone who had nothing to hide. The lead vehicle's door opened, and out stepped a woman in military dress uniform. She was maybe 50 years old, with short gray hair and the kind of bearing that comes from decades of command. The insignia on her collar identified her as a colonel. "Miss Calloway, I'm Colonel Patricia Hendricks with the United States Air Force. We need to talk." My mouth went dry, but I managed to keep my voice steady. "About what?" "About the P-51 Mustang you've been working on in your grandfather's barn for the past month." There was no point in denying it. They obviously knew everything already. "Are you here to arrest me?" Colonel Hendricks smiled, and it wasn't the expression I was expecting. "Miss Calloway, we're not here to arrest you. We're here to thank you." She gestured toward the barn. "May we take a look at what you've accomplished?" I led them into the barn, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. The P-51 sat under the LED work lights I'd installed, looking better than it had in decades. The engine cowling was off, showing the rebuilt Merlin Vi-12. The cockpit was partially disassembled as I worked on the mysterious navigation equipment. Colonel Hendricks walked around the plane slowly, running her hands along the fuselage exactly the way I had that first day. "Remarkable. You've made more progress in 1 month than we thought possible." "We?" She turned to face me. "Miss Calloway, the United States Air Force has been looking for this specific aircraft for 80 years. We never stopped. Your grandfather was one of the most decorated intelligence officers of World War II, and this plane represents one of the most significant technological recoveries of the entire war." My legs felt weak. "Intelligence officer?" Operation Nightfall was a joint project between the Army Air Forces and the Office of Strategic Services. In late 1944, we learned that German scientists had developed a revolutionary navigation and targeting system that could guide aircraft with unprecedented precision. Your grandfather led a team that recovered this technology from a captured German research facility. Colonel Hendricks pulled out a tablet and showed me photographs I'd never seen. Grandpa in military uniform, standing with a group of men in front of what looked like a bombed German laboratory. Another photo showing the same P-51 that now sat in the barn, but with German equipment being loaded into its fuselage. The plan was to test the technology, understand how it worked, and then integrate it into our own aircraft. But during the final test flight in November 1945, your grandfather made a different decision. He realized that this technology was too dangerous to exist. In the wrong hands, it could revolutionize warfare in ways that would destabilize the entire world. She swiped to another image. It was a classified report with Grandpa's signature at the bottom. He reported the aircraft as lost in a training accident and was ordered to maintain silence about the entire operation. We assumed he had destroyed the plane and the technology. We were wrong. He kept it to protect it. For 80 years, your grandfather was the guardian of one of the most advanced navigation systems ever developed. What you've been restoring isn't just a P-51 Mustang, Miss Calloway. It's a piece of technology that's still decades ahead of our current capabilities. I stared at the plane with new understanding. The cars I've been seeing, the surveillance, you've been watching me. We've been protecting you. Once we realized what you'd discovered, we had to make sure no one else got to you first. There are organizations, both foreign and domestic, that would kill to obtain this technology. Colonel Hendricks walked over to the experimental navigation equipment I'd been puzzling over for weeks. What you've been looking at is a quantum-enhanced positioning system that uses principles we're only beginning to understand today. It can guide an aircraft to within inches of any target, anywhere in the world, regardless of weather, electronic, jamming, or any other interference. The implications hit me like a physical blow. That's why the others died, the people who were researching similar things. Some of them, yes. We've been monitoring internet searches and research requests related to Operation Nightfall for decades. Most people who stumble across references to it are harmless researchers or curious family members. But some are foreign agents or private contractors working for people who shouldn't have this technology. She turned back to me with an expression I couldn't read. Which brings us to why we're really here, Miss Calloway. The Air Force would like to offer you a position. I blinked. What? We want you to head a new classified restoration program for historically significant aircraft. You'll work with a team of the best mechanics and engineers in the country, with unlimited resources and access to technologies most people can't even imagine. Your first project will be completing the restoration of this P-51 and helping us understand how the navigation system works. My mind was reeling. What about the farm? The debt? The position comes with a substantial salary, plus a signing bonus that will more than cover your current financial obligations. You can keep the farm and use it as a private restoration facility for our program. Everything you've ever wanted to do with vintage military aircraft, you'll be able to do with the full backing of the United States Air Force. I looked at the plane, then back at Colonel Hendricks. And if I say no, then you say no. The plane will be moved to a secure facility, the technology will be studied by other people, and you'll receive a financial settlement for its return. But Miss Calloway, your grandfather spent his entire life preparing you for this moment. Every tool he taught you to use, every engine he helped you understand, every lesson about persistence and craftsmanship was leading to this. She handed me a business card and a thick envelope. The envelope contains our formal offer and all the details you'll need to make your decision. Take your time, think it over. But know that this technology is going to be studied and understood, eventually. The question is whether you want to be part of that process, or whether you want to walk away and let others finish what you and your grandfather started. As the SUVs drove away, I stood in the barn looking at the plane that had changed everything. In my hands was an offer that would fulfill every dream I'd ever had and solve every problem I was facing. The only question was whether I was ready to step into the world that Grandpa had been protecting me from my entire life. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Grandpa's old kitchen. The Air Force's offer spread across the same table where I'd been calculating bills and facing foreclosure just weeks earlier. The signing bonus alone was more money than I'd ever imagined having. The salary would let me keep the farm and turn it into something Grandpa never could have dreamed of. But more than the money, this was everything I'd wanted since I was 8 years old, working alongside him in his workshop. The next morning I walked back into the barn and really looked at the P-51 for what felt like the first time. This wasn't just a restored warplane anymore. It was a bridge between the man who raised me and the person I was meant to become. Every lesson Grandpa had taught me, every hour we'd spent together fixing engines and talking about the importance of preserving history, had been leading to this moment. I called Colonel Hendricks that afternoon and accepted the position. 3 months later, I was standing in a state-of-the-art restoration hangar at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, watching a team of specialists carefully transport Grandpa's P-51 to its new home. The plane had been fully restored under my supervision, and the quantum navigation system was now functional for the first time in 80 years. The technology was even more advanced than anyone had imagined. But the real surprise came when Colonel Hendricks walked me into another hangar and showed me what else they'd been working on. There were 12 other aircraft from various classified programs spanning from World War II to the present day. Each one had a story, each one represented technology that had been hidden away, waiting for the right person to bring it back to light. "This is your department now," she told me. "The Historical Technology Preservation Program. Your job is to find these lost pieces of aviation history and help us understand what our predecessors were working on." I thought about Grandpa then, about how he'd spent decades keeping secrets that he couldn't share with anyone. Now I understood the weight he'd been carrying all those years, but I also understood why he'd never told me the truth until after he was gone. This kind of responsibility had to be chosen, not inherited. The farm became exactly what Colonel Hendricks had promised. We converted the main barn into a specialized restoration facility, and the fields that Grandpa used to plant, with wheat, now housed additional hangars for the program's aircraft. I kept his workshop exactly as he'd left it, down to the coffee-stained manual on the workbench and the old toolbox he'd taught me to use. 6 months into the job, I made a discovery that brought everything full circle. While researching another classified aircraft, I found a personnel file that mentioned Grandpa's original recommendation for Operation Nightfall. The man who had recruited him for the program was someone I recognized from the old photographs in the barn. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, and according to the file, he had specifically requested Ezra Calloway for the mission because of his exceptional mechanical aptitude and uncompromising integrity. The same qualities Grandpa had spent my entire childhood instilling in me. I realized then that my whole life had been preparation for this moment. Every engine we'd rebuilt together, every time he'd made me start over because something wasn't quite right, every lecture about the responsibility that comes with knowledge and skill had been his way of training me for a job I didn't even know existed. But the most important lesson came from understanding why he'd made the choice to hide the plane instead of turning it over to the military in 1945. It wasn't about disobeying orders or keeping secrets for their own sake. It was about recognizing that some technologies are too powerful to release without careful consideration of their consequences. Today, the P-51 sits in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, fully restored and displayed with a plaque that tells the true story of Operation Nightfall. The quantum navigation system has been studied and understood, and its principles are being used to develop navigation technologies that will revolutionize both military and civilian aviation. Visitors to the museum can read about Technical Sergeant Ezra Calloway, who recovered enemy technology that was decades ahead of its time and made the difficult decision to protect it until the world was ready to use it responsibly. They can also read about his granddaughter Bryn, who discovered his secret and chose to honor his legacy by ensuring that hidden technologies serve the greater good rather than private interests. But what the plaque doesn't mention is the most important thing Grandpa taught me. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't the answer to their problems, but the tools and wisdom they need to find their own answers. He could have told me about the plane years earlier, could have shared the burden of his secret, could have made the decision for me about what to do with the discovery. Instead, he trusted me to make the right choice when the time came. He believed that everything he'd taught me about persistence, integrity, and the responsibility that comes with knowledge would guide me to the decision he hoped I'd make, but couldn't make for me. Standing in that museum now, watching Air Force cadets study the plane that changed my life, I understand what legacy really means. It's not about the things you leave behind or the secrets you keep. It's about the values you pass on and the confidence you have that the people you love will use those values to make the world a better place. Grandpa Ezra spent his entire life protecting a piece of history that could have been dangerous in the wrong hands. But more importantly, he spent that same time preparing me to recognize when something is worth protecting and when it's time to bring it into the light. That's a lesson that goes far beyond aviation technology or family secrets. It's about understanding that some mysteries are meant to be solved by the right person at the right time, and having the wisdom to know when you're that person.